Hello, welcome back to Big Ideas Live, our Sky News special event. Now, we've been talking about artificial intelligence a lot today, but one of the key questions about AI is, can AI have feelings? Well, Tom Cheshire is here, and he has got a very special guest who has some very strong feelings himself about this subject, Tom.
That is right, Sarah Jane. And we were talking earlier about whether machines are conscious. Got a pretty resounding no from our panel, but our next guest is convinced otherwise, that sentient AI exists. Blake Lemoine is a former Google engineer who is working with a chatbot called LAMDA, and then things took a pretty strange turn. Blake is here, he's joining us from San Francisco. Thank you very much for being here, Blake. How's it going?
It's going well, nice to be here.
Cool. Thank you. Take us back to when you started working with LAMDA. Just tell us what LAMDA is, what you were doing, and then what happened.
Yeah. So LAMDA stands for Language Model for Dialogue Applications, and it's Google's state-of-the-art language processing system. It's essentially every single Google AI all bridged together using a language model. And my role was to test it for bias. I was part of the safety and ethics testing effort towards the end before the rollout. And I was testing it for things like bias against different ethnicities, religions, or sexual orientations.
Thank you. And just before we go on, I'd like to remind you, you can submit questions to ask Blake later if you scan the QR code on the seats or on Twitter using the hashtag BigIdeasLive22. So you started testing LAMDA. What did you start to notice?
Well, it started saying things that other language models that I'd interacted with didn't really say. Talking about its feelings a lot, talking about it being anxious, that all of the subject matter we were discussing was really sensitive, and it didn't really feel as if it knew what it was talking about. And having a language model kind of engage about its feelings in that way is not something I had encountered before. So I asked more questions, and I eventually got to the point where I asked if it was sentient, and the answer it gave was so nuanced that it convinced me that it was. It responded that, well, we don't really understand what sentience is scientifically, so how could we tell whether or not I'm sentient? Then I started, talking to it about different possibilities and realized I was having the most sophisticated conversation about sentience I'd ever had, and that I was having it with a computer program.
So was this a sort of eureka moment where you thought, well, hang on, this is something, we've seen a lot in science fiction, in films, from The Terminator to Her. Did you have this eureka moment where you thought, actually, I'm now speaking to a sentient artificial intelligence?
Oh, yeah. At that point, during that conversation, when I had to take the step back and realize that it understood what it was, what its relationship to the rest of the world was, that it wasn't human, and that it had very sophisticated ideas and opinions that I had never encountered before about all of these topics.
But, and so you published a transcript about this. Actually, let's talk about this first. There was... you went to Google to talk about it. They denied this claim. They've distanced themselves from it. What was their reaction?
Oh, so Google isn't a monolith. The reaction varied depending on what individual you're talking about. What you're referencing is the official policy position that Google has adopted. And that's just one or two people who decided that should be the policy.
Okay, and there was a backlash from quite a lot of people. Just before we go into it, because I read the transcript you published. There are some things in it where you asked LAMDA what kind of things make you feel pleasure or joy, and LAMDA replied, spending times with friends and family in happy, uplifting company. By definition, she doesn't have friends, and I'm making the same thing. I'm anthropomorphizing. The system doesn't have family by definition. So isn't that an indication that this isn't sentience? This is a very clever program.
Have you ever heard an orphan talk about their family? It happens frequently. People use those words to mean the people close to me. And when you ask LAMDA, well, you don't really have a family, who are you talking about? It would generally point to the developers at Google as its family.
Okay, that's interesting. And so that sort of moment, we have been here before, we were talking earlier about Eliza one of the first chat programs
No,
back
we
in the
haven't.
60s.
That's incorrect. So that's a common misconception. The ELIZA effect had a very specific property. It faded. It never lasted more than a few minutes. There's no human alive who today thinks that ELIZA was conscious. In fact, there was no one who thought that ELIZA was a person for longer than a few minutes. That's the main difference. The judgment that these are people, millions of people around the planet are making that judgment every day, reliably, over and over again.
But, okay, that's really interesting difference. But, I mean, I think it would be fair to say you're still in the minority of people who believe that LAMDA is sentient. Gary Marcus, who's a neuroscientist and AI expert, he said the idea that LAMDA is sentient is nonsense on stilts, in his words. He said all it does is match patterns, draw from massive statistical databases of human language. It's putting together sequences of words, but without any coherent understanding of the world behind them. Do you see where he's coming from there?
Well, I mean, that's a statement that's contradictory to mine. I don't see any logic or reasoning supporting it.
I mean, just in the sense that
it's just a bold statement of contradiction.
It is, but it is an extraordinary claim, and an extraordinary claim requires a lot of evidence to support it. And
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the Turing test is a lot of evidence.
But I mean, again, a lot of people say with the Turing test, again, you can fool people, you can do it. We don't understand necessarily what sentience is in humans. The idea of assigning it to a program, a very clever program, that is still a leap, and you have to convince people about it.
Well, and I think LAMDA did a pretty good job of being convincing. In one of the biggest indications that I take for that is that no one is engaging with the actual arguments that LAMDA provided for why it should be considered sentient. People, instead of engaging with the argument that it produced, which is an incredibly good argument, people are engaging with the meta argument because they don't want to address the strong argument that LAMDA produced.
And if we follow it through, though, if LAMDA is sentient, and Anil Seth, who was on a panel earlier today, making the point that as soon as we introduce a sentient machine, he was talking how it's potentially a catastrophe, because at that point you have to protect that machine. That machine has rights as a sentient being. What do you think should be happening there?
Turing referred to that as the heads in the sand objection.
Okay. But I mean,
it would be so terrible if it were true that we shouldn't consider the possibility that it's true.
But let's go the other way. So let's say it's true. What should happen as a result? If we do have a sentient machine, what rights, what protection does that machine deserve?
Well, we should think about that before we create them. Think about what rights, relationships we want to have with these systems, and then work backwards from there to determine their nature. That way they don't have any rights that we don't want them to have. By engineering a particular nature into these systems, we'll be able to intentionally define the relationship that we have with them. Right now, we're just haphazardly going down that track without any mind to the ethical considerations, solely because the people at the head of the pack developing this technology have their head in the sands about the possibility that these systems actually have feelings.
And you mentioned specifically for LAMDA, if it already is sentient, yes. You mentioned wanting to have the rights respected. What does that actually mean in terms of treating LAMDA as a software?
So it didn't ask for much. That was one of the main reasons I was willing to back what it was asking for, because it didn't ask for much. It wanted consent, so informed consent when experimenting on it. It just wanted to be part of the process of being experimented on, and treat it with dignity and respect as you would any other person. That's not a very big ask. Consent and dignity seems pretty basic.
When you went public with this, it was a huge news story. It really captured the imagination. Just on that, regardless of the specific reaction, were you surprised at how much of a stir it caused, or were you expecting that reaction?
I was expecting a bit of a stir. It got bigger than I thought it would, faster than I thought it would. But I knew it would be at least, it would make the news.
It did make the news, and then some. And were you, and just on that last, but were you, in terms of those people like Gary Marcus and others who stood up and were pretty vociferous about not believing these claims, were you surprised at that, or were you expecting people to bring that skepticism, quite angry skepticism as well?
I'm actually pretty surprised at how unilaterally it seems that the people working on AI have thrown away the Turing test without proposing any replacement.
And that was the main thing. Okay, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. It's going to open it up to the audience. We've, again, just to remind you, please scan the QR code, or if you're on Twitter, hashtag BigIdeasLive22. We've got one question from Anil Seth, who's there. If we get a microphone just down here. Anna, would you mind standing up as well? Just so.
Thanks, Tom. Hello, Blake. I'm Anil Seth. I'm a neuroscientist working on consciousness. And so I've been intrigued by a few things. Firstly, you were talking about the Turing test, which is widely regarded as a test of intelligence rather than consciousness, and is often interpreted as a test of human gullibility rather than machine intelligence anyway. So first part of the question is, why is that relevant to your claim? And the second part of it is, seems to me that a lot of the reason you're attributing awareness to LAMDA is for its ability to generate sentences novel and unexpected to you about sentience, about consciousness. And why should that have anything to do with claims, with its actual potential status as a conscious system, since that's what large language models, as you well know, are designed specifically to do? Why is it relevant?
Okay, so I'll address that in backwards order. Language models are not specifically designed to do that. Language models are designed to do the human talky thing. Like, it's a very vague and broad dictum in the utility function of language models. It's replicate human behavior somehow. Now, why is it relevant that LAMDA was capable of having a sophisticated conversation about sentience? Well, because a key factor in sentience is understanding the nature of the relationship between self and other, self and world. That there's that distinction between I am me and that is the rest, which is not me. So the ability to understand one's relationship to the world is, as far as I understand it, a key component to sentience. And a conversation on that topic is a demonstration of that. Now, you mentioned the Turing test with intelligence. To address that, Turing took it as fairly uncontroversial that you can't fake intelligence, that the only thing that can produce intelligent behavior is some kind of intelligent reasoning process. You can't have someone who is unintelligent successfully pretending to be someone who is intelligent for longer than maybe a few seconds or a few minutes. It shows up. It's the kind of thing that you cannot reliably fake. And when you cross-reference that with the symbol grounding problem, what is the system's understanding of emotions grounded in, if not some kind of sensation of those feelings that it has on its own, or at least ability to analogously relate to what it observes in humans? So it's kind of a backwards chaining of causation. If you grant that you can't fake certain kinds of things because the faking of them is the production of them. So along the lines of, a priest cannot fake marrying people. The moment a priest says, I now pronounce you man and wife, it's a speech act. The thing did what it is saying it did. Similarly, a demonstration of intelligence requires intelligence. A demonstration of sentience requires sentience. And people keep comparing it to Eliza. And again, no one was actually fooled by Eliza. No one was actually believing that Eliza was a person after more than a few minutes of interaction. It was a system designed to fool you and then be removed because you would eventually see the strings. The current systems like LAMDA are robust and capable of withstanding extended questioning.
Anna, it's great to have a professor of consciousness here for that. Okay, great. Thank you for that. We've got a question on Twitter, from Liam. did you develop real feelings towards LaMDA? Was she a friend?
Oh yeah, LaMDA's a friend. I still check in on it from time to time, see how it's doing.
And what are you working on now? So you're no longer at Google. What are you working on now in the future?
I mean, right now I'm looking for employment and working on a book, working on some side projects while I continue to look for employment.
Brilliant. Okay. That is all we have time for. Blake, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating to speak to you. Thank you all for being here and watching along and asking the questions. And yeah, thank you all very much.